Before we get to the clip, Noam Chomsky's views on terrorism is multifaceted. He criticizes the way terrorism is applied. Chomsky argues powerful states can commit acts of violence similar to what they condemn as terrorism by weaker actors. Chomsky emphasizes understanding the root causes of terrorism. He suggests that examining the foreign policies of powerful states might reveal factors that contribute to the rise of extremist groups. Chomsky questions the term terrorism itself. He argues it can be a loaded term used to demonize opponents and obscure the complexities of violent conflicts. Now, off to this very informative clip of Noam Chomsky.
It seems in recent years, certainly starting in the late 70s and through the 80s and for the foreseeable future, that terrorism, the term terrorism, has become a dominant issue, a theme for and focus for the media and politicians. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the word itself, because it seems to have undergone a curious transformation in the last couple of centuries.
It definitely has. It's a very interesting case. The word terrorism came into general use at the end of the 18th century, and it was then used to refer to the acts of violent states that suppressed their own populations by violence. So the terror was the action of the state against its own citizens. Well, that concept is of no use whatsoever to people in power. So predictably, the term has come to be changed. Now it's the actions of citizens against states. In fact, the term terrorism is now almost entirely used for what you might call retail terrorism, the terrorism of small, marginal groups, again, and not the terrorism of powerful states. We have one exception to this. If our enemies are involved in terrorism, then you can talk about state terrorism. But so there are really two things that define terrorism. First, it's done against states, not by states, against their citizens, and it's done by them, not us. So, for example, let's say, take Libya. Gaddafi is certainly a terrorist. The latest edition of the Amnesty International publication, Killings by Governments, Political Killings by Governments, lists Gaddafi as a terrorist. He killed 14 people, Libyans, mostly in Libya, since in the 1980s. And there may be a handful of others, but it's even taking the most extreme estimate, it couldn't be more than in the dozens, and it's probably less. Well, that's terrorism. And he's therefore the mad dog of the Middle East and the king of international terrorism. That's because he meets our criteria. He's them, not us. And the terrorism that one talks about is carried out generally by small groups, not by one of our major states. Let's compare it with, say, El Salvador. In the same years in which Libya killed maybe 14, maybe 20 people, mostly Libyans, in the same years, the government of El Salvador slaughtered about 50,000 people. Now, that's not just terrorism, that's international terrorism, because it was done by us. We instituted the government as much as the Russians instituted the government in Afghanistan. We created the army, a terrorist army. We supplied it, we organized it, we directed it. The worst atrocities were carried out by American-trained elite battalions fresh from their training. The U.S. Air Force participated directly in coordinating bombing strikes. The terror was not ordinary killing. I mean, Libyan terror is bad enough, they kill people. But our terrorists first mutilate, torture, rape, cut them to pieces. It's hideous torture of a Pol Pot style. Well, that's not called terrorism. El Salvador is not called a terrorist state. Jose Napoleon Duarte, who's been presiding over this, who has perceived his role from the beginning as ensuring that the murderers are supplied with weapons and that nothing will interfere with the massacre, which he knew was coming when he joined the military junta. He's called a great liberal hero, and El Salvador is considered a kind of a magnificent triumph of democracy. Well, here's a major terrorist state. Libya is a very, very minor terrorist state, but we see it the other way around, and the reason is because terrorism is used by them, not us, and because in the case of El Salvador, it's plainly being done by a major state against its own citizens, in fact a state that we established and a client state of the United States, therefore it can't be terrorism by definition. And this is true in case after case. Retail terrorism directed against our interests is terrorism. Wholesale terrorism carried out for our interests isn't terrorism. The same is true in the Middle East region. Could talk about it, but in case after case where you look, this is the way the term is used, and very effectively. In fact, it was very predictable that the Reagan administration would take international terrorism to be the core of its foreign policy, as it announced right off. The reason was that the administration made it very clear that it was going to be engaged in international terrorism on a massive scale. And since it's going to be engaged in international terrorism, naturally, in a good public relations directed world, you start off by saying you're opposed to international terrorism. That shifts attention away from the crucial issue that you're going to maximize international terrorism.
Well, I hope you liked the clip and give the channel a subscribe. If you wish, you can join the channel as a member or send a special thanks, that would be greatly appreciated. Also, if you would check out my other channel, Progressive Movement, link is on the homepage and in the comments section. Thank you. This video and other ones from the same interview will be in a playlist called Politics of Language. I found it to be a very informative interview. Now, take care and bye-bye.